It was a Tuesday evening at La Trattoria, the kind of night when the restaurant hummed with quiet business, the kind that only looked legitimate to outsiders. 3 men sat in the corner booth, partially hidden by shadow and cigar smoke. Vincenzo Moretti, Luca Romano, Marco De Luca. They were discussing a shipment that had gone missing, their voices low, their faces carved from stone. Then the front door chimed. Everyone stopped. A girl no older than 9 stepped inside wearing a blue hoodie that swallowed her small frame. Her face was pale but fierce, her eyes holding the kind of desperation that made even hardened criminals sit up straighter. She walked directly toward their table. No hesitation. When she reached them, she pulled a black pistol from her hoodie pocket and raised it toward Vincenzo's chest. Her voice came out steady, heartbreakingly steady. "Which one of you is my father?" Silence crashed over the restaurant like a breaking wave. The busboys froze. The bartender's hand stopped mid-pour. Even the ambient jazz seemed to hold its breath. No one laughed. No one reached for a weapon. Because what stared back at them wasn't just a child with a gun. It was desperation wearing a 9-year-old's face. Vincenzo, known in certain circles as the architect, slowly set down his wine glass. "Careful, Bambina," he said quietly. "Guns are dangerous things for small hands." "My mom's dying," the girl announced, her grip tightening. "She's in St. Anthony's Hospital, room 112. She said I have 3 days to find my father before they put me in foster care." The words hung there, unraveling something in the men's faces. "And she's never wrong about who my dad is?" the girl continued, her voice cracking slightly. "She said he'd be here. One of you 3. Luca leaned forward slowly, the enforcer they called him. Eyes that had seen too much violence to be moved by almost anything. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sofia Rivera. My mom's Rebecca Rivera. She worked here as a bartender 9 years ago." The air in the restaurant changed. Vincenzo's jaw tightened. Luca exchanged a glance with Marco, the smooth-talking negotiator who suddenly didn't look so smooth anymore. They remembered Rebecca. Beautiful, kind, the only woman who'd ever stepped into their world and walked away clean. She disappeared one night 9 years ago without explanation. Until now. "Where's your mom now?" Marco asked, his voice careful. "Dying. Her boyfriend pushed her down the stairs when she said she wanted to tell me the truth about my real father." "Her boyfriend's name?" Vincenzo asked. "Detective William Hayes. He said if she ever tells anyone who my dad is, he'll kill us both." The temperature in the room dropped. Corrupt cop. A woman trying to protect her child. A little girl with a gun. Sofia's hand trembled now. Not from fear, but from the weight of what she was holding. "I can't go to foster care," she whispered. "Mom said there's a group home where he has connections. She said the people running it, they hurt girls like me." The implication of that statement made every criminal in that room consider murder. "She told me to come here," Sofia continued, tears finally threatening but held back by sheer will. "She said my real father would protect me. She said he promised she'd always be safe." Vincenzo stared at the child, his mind flashing backward, to a winter night 9 years ago. A woman in tears. A promise he'd made that he'd broken by letting her disappear. "Who taught you to shoot?" Luca asked suddenly. "Mom did. She said I'd need it someday." Sofia's grip on the gun steadied. The tears stayed back. She wasn't just a frightened child anymore. She was her mother's daughter, taught to survive at any cost. Marco pulled out his phone with shaking hands. "Let me make a call. Someone who can help." He dialed Nico, their hacker, the one person they trusted with secrets that could destroy them. "Detective William Hayes," Marco said into the phone, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Metro PD. What do we have on him?" Nico's voice came through, sharp and digital. 3 complaints of excessive force, all dismissed. "He's connected to Captain Walsh, runs that foster home charity, the one in the news for missing children." "Actually, let me dig deeper. William, these files are encrypted, but..." Oh no. "What?" Vincenzo demanded. "He's not just protecting the foster home. He's running something inside it. There are names here, kids who went missing. Some of them were in Hayes' custody. The implications crystallized in the room like ice. That's when they heard the sirens. Multiple cars, getting closer. Did you tell anyone you were coming here? Vincenzo asked Sofia, his tone controlled but urgent. No. But he has a tracker on my phone. Give me it, Marco commanded. Snake, no, not Snake, that was the other story. Nico, through the speakerphone, barked instructions. Destroy it. Now. Marco smashed the phone into the restaurant's stone fireplace. Too late. 8 cop cars surrounded La Trattoria. Their lights painted the windows red and blue like a warning. The front door burst open. Detective William Hayes strutted in like he owned the place. Tall, muscled, with eyes that lingered too long on Sofia. He wore his authority like armor, a corruption so comfortable it showed in his smile. There you are, sweetheart, he said, his voice syrupy and dangerous. Time to come home. Sofia's gun raised higher. She's not going anywhere with you, Vincenzo stated coldly. Hayes laughed. 8 corrupt officers outside. 3 men with criminal records inside. You sure about that calculation? She's mine, Luca said. Everyone turned. The enforcer stood slowly, his scarred hands opening and closing. His voice, when it came, was lower than a whisper but heard by everyone. I'm her father. Vincenzo's head snapped toward him. Marco's eyes widened. Hayes laughed, but it was hollow now. You just admitted that in front of 8 witnesses and a badge. I did, Luca said simply. And I want a DNA test to prove it. Doesn't matter, Hayes spat. Her mother signed power of attorney while she was sedated. Lily, Sofia, is mine to place. You forced her to sign while she was incapacitated, Sofia said loudly, her voice stronger now that she wasn't standing alone. The restaurant's back door opened. A woman in a hospital gown stepped through, moving slowly, each step a battle against gravity and pain. Elena Rivera looked like she'd been put through hell. Because she had been. I recorded everything, Elena whispered, holding up a small voice recorder. 2 years of it. Hayes' face went white. Every threat. Every time you touched me. Every time you said what you'd do to my daughter if I ever told anyone about her father. She's confused from head trauma, Hayes tried. The security camera footage isn't confused, a new voice said. Dr. Patricia Kim walked in behind Elena, wearing her white coat like a shield. It shows exactly what happened on those stairs. And what you did. Hayes reached for his gun. Luca reached faster. But before Luca could move, Sofia did something no one expected. Her hand didn't shake. The 9-year-old girl fired once. The bullet caught Hayes in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Perfect aim. Controlled. Not a kill shot, a choice. My mom taught me, Sofia said quietly, that protecting yourself and the people you love is never a crime. The sirens changed in tone. Through the windows, they saw new cars arrive, unmarked, purposeful. Chief Reynolds walked through the door with internal affairs detectives, their faces set with the grim satisfaction of people who'd finally caught what they'd been hunting. Detective Thompson, Reynolds said coldly, you're under arrest for excessive force, corruption, and attempted murder of a minor. Miranda rights apply. Anything you say. Hayes was on the ground, bleeding, still trying to talk his way out of something he couldn't talk away from anymore. Captain Walsh was arrested at his home 40 minutes later. The DNA results would take weeks. But in La Trattoria, as Elena recovered in a safe hospital room and Sofia sat between Vincenzo and Luca, it didn't matter anymore. Luca had stepped into the role before biology could. Vincenzo had promised protection before paternity could be proven. Marco, despite his doubts earlier, had made the first call that saved them all. We'll get the tests, Vincenzo said quietly to Sofia. But no matter what they say, she's already family, Luca finished. Sofia looked between them, exhausted, her small hand gripping Luca's coat. Promise? She asked. In this family, Vincenzo said, a promise is blood, and blood, once spilled, binds us forever. The gun from that evening now hangs on the wall of La Trattoria, mounted in glass beneath a small copper plaque that reads, The night a little girl walked in alone and taught devils they still had hearts. The restaurant was still. Sophia's gun had lowered only slightly, hanging at her side like an anchor that might pull her under at any moment. Elena lay in a hospital bed blocks away, and they all felt the weight of her absence like a fourth person at the table. Vincenzo was the first to speak. "Elena," he said quietly, testing the name like it was a word in a language he'd forgotten. "She worked here. A long time ago." His voice carried something the men around him rarely heard from the architect: uncertainty. Luca's jaw tightened. Marco looked away. "The bartender," Marco said. 9 years. 10. 10, Vincenzo corrected, his eyes never leaving Sophia's face. She was the only woman who ever worked in this place. The only one who lasted. Sophia watched them carefully, reading the flinch that crossed Vincenzo's mouth when he said those words. "She was different," Luca added, his voice rough. "She'd listen to your problems without judgment. She'd laugh like she meant it. She never asked questions about what we did. She understood the code," Marco said. "Never talked, never left, never complained." But then, all at once, she was gone. The men had pieced together the disappearance 1,000 times over the years, each version more painful than the last. One night Elena clocked out, hung her apron on the back door, and vanished like she'd never existed at all. Sophia's lip trembled. "She said she had to protect me," she said. "She said she couldn't raise me here. That if you knew about me, it would make her a target." Vincenzo closed his eyes. "She came to my office once," he said, his voice low. "It was December. She was crying. I'd never seen her cry before that." He paused, and in that pause lived 10 years of regret. "She said she was leaving, that she was pregnant and she had to leave. I asked her why. She wouldn't tell me. She just said, because he promised I'd be safe, and I believed him." Sophia's entire body went rigid. "She said one of you promised to keep us safe," the girl whispered. "So why didn't you?" The question detonated in the center of the table. The men exchanged glances, long, weighted, full of calculation and guilt and the terrible recognition that they might have failed someone they all, in their own way, had loved. "We didn't know," Marco said, but it sounded like an excuse even as he said it. "You didn't ask?" Sophia snapped back, tears finally breaking free. "My mom was right here, and you didn't even ask." She was right. They all knew it. Luca leaned forward, his scarred hands spread on the table. "What's his name? This boyfriend?" "Detective William Hayes." The air crystallized. Vincenzo's face went blank in a way that suggested he was accessing memories he'd spent years trying to forget. Luca and Marco exchanged one sharp look, the kind that passed information between men who'd been in the underworld long enough to know exactly what kind of predator wore a badge. "Hayes," Vincenzo repeated. "The cop who's been extorting us for 3 years. The one who killed Russo's warehouse manager and called it a drug bust. The one who plays hero on the news while taking bribes from the Castellanos," Marco added. Sophia nodded miserably. "He's been hurting her for years. She tried to leave twice. He found her both times. Now she's in the hospital because she finally told me about my father. She said she was going to come here, to tell one of you." The weight of that landed differently now. Elena hadn't disappeared because she wanted to protect them. She'd disappeared because she was trying to protect herself and a daughter they'd never known existed. "Where is she?" Luca asked. "St. Anthony's Hospital, room 112. She's been asking for someone. A name she kept saying. But she wouldn't tell me who." Vincenzo stood slowly. When he did, the entire restaurant seemed to shift. The ambient noise fading, the shadows deepening. This wasn't the careful businessman now. This was something older, something more dangerous. "We're going to the hospital," he said, his voice carved from stone. "We're going to find Elena, and then we're going to understand exactly who this man is and what he's done." He looked at Sophia, and in his eyes was a decision that transcended blood or biology. "Whether she's mine or not, that girl has a father tonight. And that father is going to protect her." Luca stood beside him without hesitation. Even Marco, weak as he was, nodded. The three men moved toward the door, leaving the evening half-finished, the wine untouched, the business abandoned. Because some promises, once made even a decade ago in the dark, could never be broken. Not in this world. Not ever. They didn't make it to the door. Sophia's voice cut through the silence like a blade. I'm not lowering this gun until someone promises. Vincenzo stopped, turned slowly. Luca's hand froze on the doorframe. Promises what? Vincenzo asked, his tone patient in a way that suggested he understood the weight of what she was asking. That you'll help her. That you won't just take me somewhere safe and then forget about her. That you won't just use me to get information from Hayes and then throw me away. Her voice didn't waver, but the gun in her hands told the real story. A child trying desperately to hold power when she had none. Vincenzo walked back to the table slowly. He didn't reach for the gun. He didn't try to intimidate her into compliance. Instead, he sat down across from her, his hands flat on the table where she could see them. In this world, he said quietly, family isn't born, it's chosen. You came to the right table, Sofia Rivera. The girl's breath caught. What does that mean? She whispered. It means, Vincenzo continued, that you walked in here pointing a gun at men you don't know, asking for protection from a man you do. That takes more courage than most people develop in a lifetime. It means you trusted your mother's instinct about who would keep you safe. And it means, he paused, letting the moment settle between them like sand at the bottom of a glass. It means you're not leaving here alone. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not until this is finished. From the kitchen, Luca's voice erupted. Vincenzo, we can't do this. The enforcer emerged, his scarred face dark with conflict. Bringing a child into this world, into our circle, that's not protection. That's a death sentence. Hayes will use her as leverage. The Castellanos will use her as leverage. Every enemy we have will see her as a target. She's already a target, Vincenzo said, not turning from Sofia's gaze. The only question is whether we leave her there or stand in front of her. That's not logic, Marco called out, appearing from the back office. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly. The negotiator in him couldn't help but calculate. That's emotion. And emotion is how we get people killed. No, Luca said, his voice dropping into dangerous territory. Emotion is how we get her killed. You want to play savior to a 9-year-old? Fine. But when this goes wrong, and it will go wrong, that blood is on you. Vincenzo finally turned toward them. His face was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made even Luca step back. My father once told me that a man without code is just a predator wearing a suit. He said the only thing that separates us from animals is knowing when to bend the code and when to break it. A child walks in here asking for help, and you want to tell her we can't? That's not code, Luca. That's cowardice. The words hung in the air like smoke. Luca's jaw clenched. He wanted to argue. Everything in his training screamed that Vincenzo was wrong. But he stood silent because he also knew, on some deeper level that transcended logic, that his boss was right. Sofia lowered the gun by an inch. Hayes has been following me, she said, her voice smaller now, more like a child than a fighter. For 3 days, he keeps showing up. At school, at the playground, asking me where I'm going, who I'm talking to. My mom said he'd track me. She said that's why I had to run. She said if he found me before I found you, he'd make me disappear. The restaurant went colder. Vincenzo's expression hardened into something that looked like steel. He stood and walked to the front windows, scanning the street beyond the glass. The evening traffic moved in normal patterns. The streetlights cast long shadows. Nothing seemed out of place. Yet, everyone out, he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Clear the restaurant. Now, tell the staff to go home. Tell the kitchen to lock up. Tell anyone on the street that we're closing early for a private event. The staff moved without question. This was the Moretti way. Questions got you killed. Marco scrambled to the phones. Luca moved through the dining room, his imposing frame a moving wall that convinced customers to finish their drinks quickly and find the exits. When the restaurant was empty except for the 3 men and the girl, Vincenzo sealed the doors. He moved through the restaurant methodically, drawing blinds, dimming lights, transforming the elegant space into something more fortress than establishment. Only then did he return to where Sophia stood. "Lower the gun," he said gently. She looked at him for a long moment. In her eyes was the desperate calculation of a child trying to decide if the monster in front of her was better than the monster behind her. Slowly, her small arm descended. The gun lowered to her side. For the first time, her shoulders slumped, the tension draining from her body like water through a broken vessel. She was just a little girl again, exhausted and terrified, and finally allowing someone else to carry the weight. Vincenzo reached out and took the gun from her trembling hands. She didn't resist. That was when they saw it. Through the front windows, headlights swept across the glass. Not one car, multiple cars moving with purpose through the street. They were turning onto their block. Luca moved to the window. 4 vehicles. Black. Moving slow. Marco's face drained of color. "They're coming here." Vincenzo held the gun, now empty of the metaphorical power it had carried all evening. He looked at Sophia, then at his men, then back at the approaching headlights. "Then we show them," he said quietly. "What happens when you hunt a child under Moretti protection?" The first headlight swept across the restaurant entrance. Everything changed. The first thing Vincenzo noticed was the choreography. 4 black SUVs surrounded La Trattoria in a pattern that suggested planning. Not a casual patrol. Not a routine check. This was a tactical deployment, the kind that meant someone had made a phone call and everyone above William Hayes had decided to look the other way. Through the sealed windows, they could see blue lights painting the street in rhythmic waves. 8 uniformed officers exited the vehicles with the kind of casual confidence that only comes from knowing you have a judge's signature in your pocket. Sophia pressed herself against the wall, her small frame nearly invisible in the shadows. The front door didn't creak open. It exploded inward. Detective William Hayes strode through the entrance like he owned the place. He was tall, muscled in the way that suggested gym time funded by bribes, with eyes that moved across the restaurant like a predator cataloging prey. Behind him came 4 armed officers, their hands resting near their service weapons with deliberate casualness. Hayes' smile was all teeth and no warmth. "William Hayes, Metro Narcotics Division," he announced, pulling a warrant from his jacket and holding it up without letting anyone actually read it. "I'm here for the minor, Sofia Rivera. She was kidnapped this afternoon from her legal guardian." Vincenzo stepped forward. Slow, deliberate, every movement calculated to project absolute calm. "We have no kidnapping here, detective. The girl came in seeking refuge. She's safe. She's fed. She's mine," Hayes interrupted, his voice cutting through the restaurant like a blade. "Her mother, Rebecca Elena Rivera, is my domestic partner. She's hospitalized and incapacitated, which means I hold power of attorney for her medical decisions and her child's welfare." The lie was so smooth, so polished, that for a moment even Vincenzo almost believed it. Sophia's whisper came from the shadows. "He's lying. He killed my mom's friend, the one who tried to tell someone about me. He pushed her off a bridge and said it was suicide." Hayes' face went rigid for exactly 1 second. Then the mask returned. "The girl is clearly confused, traumatized. She's been telling stories to manipulate the situation. Now, I'm going to take her into protective custody, and the rest of you are going to step aside." "No," Vincenzo said simply. The temperature in the restaurant shifted like a door opening onto winter. Hayes' jaw clenched. His hand moved toward his badge, an unconscious gesture that suggested he was about to make threats backed by authority. "You're harboring a minor without parental consent. That's kidnapping under state statute 23-4. I can arrest every single person in this restaurant right now." "You could," Vincenzo agreed, his tone thoughtful. "But that would require you to actually call it in, to file paperwork, to explain why a detective with 3 excessive force complaints and a pending investigation from the DA's office is personally executing a custody warrant at 9 o'clock at night." Behind Hayes, One of the officers shifted uncomfortably. Luca had moved position. He was now standing between Hayes and Sophia, his massive frame a wall of scarred muscle and contained violence. Marco was near the back, his hand already pulling out his phone. Hayes' eyes narrowed. "You want to play smart with me, Moretti? I've been investigating your family for 3 years. I know exactly what happens in this restaurant. I know about the money movements, the supplier connections, Then you know," Vincenzo interrupted, his voice dropping into dangerous territory, "that interfering with our business is a bad idea, and taking someone under our protection is an act of war." The words weren't a threat exactly. They were a statement of fact delivered with the kind of certainty that made predators understand they'd miscalculated their prey. One of the officers took a step back. Hayes saw it. He felt the shift in power like a physical thing, and it enraged him. "My mom recorded everything," Sophia suddenly yelled, her voice cracking with desperation. "She has tapes of you. Everything you said you'd do to me. Everything you did to her." Hayes lunged. It wasn't a tactical move. It was pure animal rage. A predator realizing his victim was escaping and lunging on instinct rather than strategy. Luca moved faster. The enforcer caught Hayes midair and drove him backward into the stone fireplace with force that seemed to crack the very foundation of the restaurant. The air exploded from Hayes' lungs. His vision blurred. For a moment he couldn't remember how to breathe. The officers drew their weapons. Vincenzo raised his hands in a gesture of peace, but his voice remained ice. "Lower your weapons or this ends badly for all of you. Right now, you have plausible deniability. You came, we resisted, you retreat and file a report. Everyone walks. You escalate and men start dying. And I promise you, the men who die won't be Morettis." The standoff crystallized. 12 seconds of silence where 4 officers calculated whether their paychecks were worth their lives. "Stand down," the senior officer finally commanded. The weapons lowered. Hayes pushed himself off the wall, gasping, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. His voice came out as a growl. "This isn't over. You think you can protect her forever? You think I don't have resources? I'll burn this place down. I'll burn all of you down." "Probably," Vincenzo acknowledged. "But not tonight." The officers escorted Hayes toward the door. He turned back one last time, his eyes locking onto Sophia with the kind of intensity that promised this was only a beginning. "I'll come back," he hissed. "And when I do, I'll take what's mine." The door closed. The blue lights remained outside, circling the restaurant like sharks. Vincenzo moved to the windows and watched as the officers placed Hayes in the back seat of one SUV, then regrouped, clearly uncertain whether to maintain surveillance or retreat entirely. They retreated, but not far. 2 vehicles remained parked across the street. Vincenzo pulled out his phone. "Nico," he said when the hacker picked up, "I need everything on Detective William Hayes. Birth records, financial accounts, connections, blackmail material, family secrets, everything. And I need it in the next 2 hours." He paused, listening. "Because," Vincenzo continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute determination, "we just made a very dangerous man understand that he can't have what he wants. And now he's going to try to take it anyway. So we need to know exactly how deep this goes, and exactly what leverage we have before he comes back." He ended the call. Outside, the darkness seemed to thicken. The 2 remaining police vehicles were still watching, waiting, planning. And inside La Trattoria, with Sophia's hand gripping his coat and Luca's breathing still heavy from the violence, Vincenzo understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was no longer about protecting a child. This was about survival. The backroom of La Trattoria smelled like old wine and older secrets. Nico hunched over his laptop, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the kind of precision that suggested he was excavating graves rather than digging through digital files. His face was lit by the pale glow of the screen, and sweat beaded at his temples despite the cool air of the restaurant's climate control. "This is bad," he said, not looking up. "This is worse than bad. This is institutional." Vincenzo stood behind him, watching code and files cascade across the monitor like rainfall. Beside them, Marco paced, his negotiator's mind trying to calculate exits that no longer existed. "Tell me," Vincenzo commanded. "Detective William Hayes, Metro Narcotics Division, but his real work is somewhere else entirely. I'm finding financial transfers from 3 separate criminal organizations, the Castellanos, the Albanian Network, and—" Nico paused, his jaw tightening. "From people inside the police department itself. Captain Walsh, 2 sergeants, a judge." He pulled up a spreadsheet that looked like a blueprint for organized corruption. "Foster home placements," Nico continued. 47 children over the past 5 years processed through the St. Anthony's system. Most of them went missing from Hayes' custody. The paperwork was falsified by someone with access to internal systems. The cases were marked closed or transferred. "Sold," Marco whispered, understanding the implication immediately. "Or worse," Nico replied. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Vincenzo felt something shift in his chest. A sensation that might have been rage or might have been the last pieces of his conscience reasserting themselves after years of compartmentalization. "How much do we have that's actionable?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm building behind his eyes. "Enough for federal charges. Not enough for a conviction without testimony. Not without Elena," Vincenzo finished. That was when Sophia stepped forward from the shadows where she'd been sitting, curled into one of the restaurant's back booths. In her small hands, she held something that looked fragile enough to break. A voice recorder, the kind that was outdated by a decade but impossible to trace, impossible to hack, impossible to deny. "Mom gave this to me," Sophia said quietly. "She said if anything ever happened, if she ever couldn't tell me herself, that I should play it. She said I'd understand everything." Vincenzo's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the recorder. He pressed play. The tape hissed to life with the sound of breathing. Elena's breathing, thin and fragile after years of holding trauma inside her chest. "If you're hearing this," Elena's voice emerged from the speaker, and Vincenzo's entire body went rigid. 10 years. He hadn't heard that voice in 10 years. He finally did it. He's finally shown his true self to you, and you know who he is. And one of the Morettas is your father. Protect her. Protect yourself. But most importantly, protect him from what he'll do if he finds out the truth. The men exchanged glances. "His name is William Hayes, and he's been hunting us for 9 years because he knows. He always knew. I told him once when I was weak, when I was scared. I told him I was pregnant with someone else's child, someone from a better world, and he's never forgiven me for that." Luca's breathing changed. "Every time I said the word father," he got more violent. "He said if I ever tried to give you a choice, if I ever let you find your real family, he'd make sure you disappeared. That's why I left. That's why I never came back. That's why I'm making this recording. Because someday he's going to push too hard, and I'm going to run out of ways to protect you." There was a pause on the tape, a sound like crying being held back by sheer force of will. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I'm sorry I made you grow up thinking you didn't have a father. The truth is you have 3. 3 men who, if they're listening to this, are probably already thinking about what they'll do to protect you. Choose the one who came first. Choose the one who remembers. Choose the one who had the courage to step forward when no one else would." The tape ended. Silence. Vincenzo's hands had formed fists at his sides. Marco's face was pale. Luca was staring at the recorder like it was a ghost that had just spoken his name. "She loved one of you," Marco said quietly. "Not all of us. One." Vincenzo looked at Sophia, and in that moment, something fundamental shifted in his eyes. She wasn't just a child seeking refuge anymore. She was a living reminder of a promise he'd made and broken, a wound that had been bleeding for a decade without his knowledge. But she was also his responsibility now. His family. "Luca," Vincenzo said, his voice carrying absolute command. "You're going to the hospital. Room 112. You're going to get Elena, and you're going to bring her somewhere safe. Somewhere Hayes can't find her." Luca was already moving. "Agreed." If Hayes finds her first. He won't, Luca interrupted, and there was something in his voice that made it sound like prophecy rather than promise. I'll die before I let that happen. He moved toward the back door, the one that led to the alley where Nico had parked the secondary vehicles, the ones that wouldn't be tracked because they were registered to shell companies that barely existed. Take Marco with you, Vincenzo instructed. And Nico, I need you to disappear this data. Back it up somewhere untraceable. Then wipe these systems clean. I want there to be no evidence that we ever knew Hayes' secrets. Luca paused at the door. And if we're followed? He asked. Then you make sure they regret it, Vincenzo replied. Luca nodded, and something ancient passed between them, the kind of understanding that existed between men who'd seen too much together to need words anymore. The enforcer pushed through the back door into the alley darkness. What he didn't see, what none of them saw from inside the restaurant, was the figure standing in the shadows across the street, watching the door close, watching Luca emerge into the night with Marco's silhouette close behind him. The figure pulled out a phone and made a single call. No words were exchanged, just coordinates and a simple message. They're moving the mother. Track them. In the restaurant, Vincenzo was too busy studying Sofia's face to notice how quiet the outside had become. Too busy seeing Elena's features reflected in the girl's eyes. Too busy wondering which confession on that tape belonged to which man. But in the alley, Luca was driving toward a hospital that no longer felt like a hospital. Felt like a trap. And he had no idea he was already walking into it. St. Anthony's Hospital smelled like disinfectant and dying hope. Luca moved through the corridors with Marco close behind, their bodies tense despite the fluorescent normalcy around them. Visiting hours had ended an hour ago, but money and a carefully folded $100 bill had convinced the security guard at the parking garage that they'd never arrived. Room 112 was on the third floor. They were halfway up the stairwell when Luca heard it, the metallic click of a round being chambered. He turned to see two officers blocking their exit, weapons drawn with the kind of comfort that suggested they'd been waiting. You're not going up there, the taller one said, his badge reading Castellano. No relation, but the name was a threat all by itself. Luca didn't hesitate. He moved like violence had a rhythm, like combat was just another language he'd learned fluently over decades of living in shadow. The first officer's weapon discharged, the sound deafening in the concrete stairwell. The bullet whistled past Luca's head and embedded itself in the wall behind him. The second officer made the mistake of looking at his partner instead of Luca. That was the only advantage the enforcer needed. His massive hand closed around the second officer's wrist, and the weapon fell to the concrete floor with a sound like prayer being abandoned. The officer screamed, but Luca's other hand was already moving, driving upward in a strike that ended consciousness before the body hit the ground. Marco had already taken down the first officer. Not through combat but through pragmatism, hitting him with the fire extinguisher he'd grabbed from the wall mount. Blood mixed with white foam on the stairwell. They didn't stop to check if the men were breathing. Room 112 was empty. Not just empty, recently empty. The bed was still warm. The monitors were still on, their screens showing the flat lines of disconnection. The door to the bathroom was open, revealing nothing but tile and more emptiness. A nurse appeared in the doorway, her name tag reading Patricia Kim. Her face was pale, and her hands were shaking. Where is she? Luca demanded, his voice the sound of something breaking inside its cage. He came about an hour ago, the nurse whispered. Detective Hayes. He had paperwork, power of attorney documents, everything looked official. He said she needed protective custody because she was a danger to herself. She didn't want to go, but he said if she didn't cooperate voluntarily, he'd declare her psychologically unfit and… Where did he take her? Marco interrupted. I don't know. She kept saying something about her daughter. She kept asking if someone named Sofia was safe. But then he gave her something, and she stopped talking, and they put her in an unmarked car and… Luca was already running. Back at La Trattoria, Vincenzo was the first to notice. Marco had gone to retrieve supplies from the storage room. That was 30 minutes ago. Nico was still at his laptop, his fingers moving across the keyboard with increasing urgency, as he tried to build redundancy into their data before the police arrived with a warrant. Sofia sat in the back booth, her small frame almost invisible in the darkness. When Marco didn't return after 10 minutes, Vincenzo's mind didn't question it. When 15 minutes passed, it calculated. When 30 minutes passed without a word, without a text, without even a sound from the storage room, Vincenzo's hand moved to the gun at his hip. He walked to the storage room door and opened it. Empty shelves. Unlocked back exit. The door that led to the alley was slightly ajar, letting in the sound of the city outside, but nothing else. No Marco. No explanation. No note. Vincenzo stood there for exactly 3 seconds. Then he understood. When he returned to the main dining area, his face had already rearranged itself into something carved from stone. Nico looked up from his laptop, reading the change in his boss's expression like a language of disaster. "He's gone," Vincenzo said simply. "Marco, gone." The implication crystallized between them like ice forming on glass. "He sold us," Nico said, not quite a question. "He sold us," Vincenzo confirmed. He walked to the window and looked out at the police vehicles still maintaining surveillance across the street. They hadn't moved, but they also hadn't sent in reinforcements. Why would they? If Marco had delivered information about the recordings, about Nico's location, about the restaurant as a staging ground, why would they need to? The trap was already set. They just had to wait for Luca to arrive with Elena, or for someone to make a mistake, or for Vincenzo's patience to finally crack. Vincenzo's line came out quiet, almost philosophical. "In our world, betrayal doesn't need a reason. Just opportunity." That was when Luca arrived. The enforcer exploded through the front door like a hurricane. His clothes disheveled, his knuckles bleeding, his face transformed by rage into something barely human. Behind him, the 2 police cars across the street suddenly came alive, engines starting, lights beginning to pulse. "She's gone," Luca snarled. "Hayes took her an hour ago. The officers at the hospital were expecting us. This whole thing was a setup." Vincenzo's expression didn't change, but his hand was already on his phone. "Nico, lock down the systems. Destroy anything that connects us to those files. Now." "Already done," the hacker replied, closing his laptop and standing. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before they move in." Luca pulled out his weapon. "Then we make those minutes count." But Vincenzo raised a hand. "No, we wait. Hayes is confident enough to move on Elena, which means he thinks he has leverage. Which means—" He stopped. His eyes moved to the back booth, where Sofia sat in the shadows. The girl was no longer there. In the alley behind La Trattoria, Sofia moved through the darkness with the precision of someone who'd spent her whole life learning to be invisible. In her pocket was the voice recorder, the one her mother had given her. In her hands was the gun, now reloaded from supplies she'd found in Vincenzo's office. She'd heard every word from the booth. She understood what was happening. Hayes had her mother. The men she'd come to find were cornered, betrayed, and running out of options. And the only one with nothing left to lose was a 9-year-old girl with a gun and the unshakable conviction that her mother had been right about one thing. Sometimes you had to save yourself. She typed an address into a burner phone she'd taken from Marco's abandoned supplies. An address her mother had made her memorize years ago, just in case. Then she stepped into the street and hailed a cab. The driver didn't ask questions. He just drove toward the warehouse district, where the city's edges began to blur into shadow and forgotten things. The restaurant had gone dark an hour ago. Not the deliberate darkness of closure, but the empty darkness of abandonment. The police had finally retreated from outside. Their surveillance shifted elsewhere, probably to tracking Luca's movements or waiting at hospitals or setting traps at the city's exits. Vincenzo and Luca stood in the office, maps spread across the desk. Nico's laptop displaying every camera feed he could access within a 2-mile radius of La Trattoria. They were planning how to find Elena. They didn't notice when Sofia slipped out the back door. She moved through the kitchen with the practiced silence of a child who'd spent years being invisible. The gun was in her jacket pocket, heavy and real and exactly what her mother had taught her to use. Her small hands didn't shake as she pushed through the kitchen's back exit into the alley. On the restaurant's front desk, she left a note in careful, childish handwriting. You said family protects each other. I'm going to protect mine. 5 minutes later, Vincenzo found it. The paper was small, the words large and deliberate. For a moment, the architect, the man who calculated 3 moves ahead, who never missed details, simply stared at the words like they were written in a language he couldn't decode. Then he understood. She's gone, he said, his voice the sound of something breaking inside. Luca was already at the laptop. Nico, every camera you have. Street level, intersections, traffic lights. Find her. Already searching, Nico replied, his fingers moving like lightning. I've got her. East 47th. Heading toward the warehouse district. She's in a cab, moving fast. Vincenzo grabbed his coat. She's going for Elena. She's 9 years old, Luca snarled. But he was already moving toward the door. So was Elena when she learned to survive, Vincenzo replied. Nico, track her location every 30 seconds. Tell us where she stops. They were in the car before Nico could confirm. The warehouse was exactly what Sophia expected. Abandoned, industrial, the kind of place where people disappeared and no one asked questions. She'd memorized the address her mother had whispered to her years ago. If anything ever happens, go here. Someone will be waiting. No one was waiting now, but her mother was here. She could feel it the way prey feels the presence of a predator, through some ancient sense that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with survival. The main loading door was unlocked. Of course it was. Hayes wanted her to find him. That had been his plan all along. Inside, the space was cavernous and hollow, lit by the ambient glow of the city bleeding through broken windows. And in the center of the concrete floor, tied to a chair with industrial tape, was Elena Rivera. Her mother looked like something broken that had been put back together wrong. Her left eye was swollen shut. Her lip was split. Her hospital gown was stained with blood that may or may not have been hers. But when she saw Sophia step out of the shadows, her remaining eye went wide with something that transcended fear. No, Elena whispered hoarsely. No, baby, you shouldn't be here. I know, Sophia said, pulling the gun from her jacket. But you taught me I'd need this someday. That was when the shadows moved. Detective William Hayes stepped out from behind a column, and he was smiling, the kind of smile that belonged on something that looked human but wasn't. In his hand was a small pistol, casual, almost forgotten. There's my little warrior, he said, his voice dripping with false affection. Your mother said you were smart. She didn't mention you were suicidal. Let her go, Sophia said, raising the gun with both hands. Her arms were shaking, but her voice was steady. Hayes laughed. Put the gun down and maybe I let you both walk out of here. Keep it up, and I make this warehouse your tomb. You're lying, Sophia replied. Of course I am, Hayes agreed cheerfully. But the point is, you're a child and you don't have the discipline to pull that trigger. Your mother taught you to hold the weapon, sure, but she didn't teach you to live with the consequences of using it. And I have killed 9 people, sweetheart. 9. Do you know what 9 dead people feels like inside your conscience? He stepped closer, his weapon never wavering. It feels like nothing, he continued, because some of us are broken in ways that little girls can't even imagine. Your mother understood that. That's why she ran. Not because she was afraid for herself. Because she was afraid of what I'd become once I got my hands on you. Sophia's gun rose higher, but her hands had begun to genuinely tremble now. You want to know who your real father is? Hayes asked, his voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. The one who came to your mother's hospital room with flowers? Who asked if she was okay? That's the one, isn't it? That's the one she chose. He paused, letting the silence crystallize. That's Luca Romano, the man who smashed me into a fireplace. The man who said he'd break my fingers if I ever touched you. You know what his real name is in our world? The Enforcer. He's killed 17 people that the police know about. Probably more that they don't. And your mother, sweet, kind Elena. She picked a murderer to be your father because she thought a murderer could protect you from me. Sophia's gun lowered by an inch. She was probably right, Hayes continued softly. But that also means the man you trust most in the world is exactly like me. Just better at hiding it. Outside, in the distance, sirens began to wail. Sophia's head snapped toward the sound. Hayes' smile widened. Internal Affairs is moving in on your precious Moretti family right now. I called them 20 minutes ago, told them everything. By morning, Vincenzo will be in custody. Luca will be running. And you, he raised his weapon. You'll be mine. Again. The sirens grew louder. Sophia's hands were shaking so violently now that she could barely hold the gun. Her mother was screaming something from the chair, pulling at the tape, trying to break free. The sirens echoed through the warehouse like a countdown. And in that moment, suspended between the man who'd abused her mother and the father she just learned was also a killer, Sofia Rivera faced a choice that no 9-year-old should ever have to make. Her finger found the trigger. The gun rose, and the sirens screamed ever closer. The warehouse door exploded inward. Vincenzo and Luca moved through it like they'd choreographed every step 1,000 times, which, in a world like theirs, they had. Luca's massive frame filled the entrance, his weapon already drawn. Vincenzo's expression was ice-carved into flesh. They saw Elena first, tied, broken, but alive. They saw Sofia second, gun raised, hands trembling, finger on the trigger. They saw Hayes last, and by then it was too late for him to matter anymore. The detective was moving toward the girl with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequence. His hand was already reaching out, his smile already forming, his voice already beginning to speak something that would have been a threat or a promise or both. Time didn't slow. It stopped. Everything crystallized into a single moment. The warehouse suspended between one reality and another. Hayes mid-lunge. Sofia mid-decision. Luca mid-step. Vincenzo mid-breath. Then the gun spoke. The shot echoed through the warehouse like a prayer being answered by something that wasn't prayer at all. The bullet caught Hayes in the shoulder, spinning him around like a dancer mid-turn. He crashed into the concrete floor, screaming, blood blooming across his white dress shirt like a rose opening in fast forward. Perfect aim. Not a kill shot. A choice. Just like her mother had taught her. The silence after was worse than the gunshot. It was the silence of a child who'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The silence of a 9-year-old understanding for the first time what it meant to harm another human being. The silence of Elena, barely conscious in her chair, watching her daughter step into a world that would never fully let her leave. The sirens were louder now. They were pulling up outside, their lights beginning to strobe through the broken windows. But before the doors could open, before the police could establish their perimeter, a black SUV screeched to a halt at the warehouse entrance. Internal Affairs. Chief Reynolds stepped out first, her badge visible, her face set with the grim satisfaction of a predator who'd finally cornered its prey. Behind her came 4 federal agents, their weapons holstered but ready, their eyes scanning the scene with the precision of people trained to document crime. Hayes was still screaming. "Detective William Hayes," Reynolds announced, her voice carrying the weight of years of investigation finally bearing fruit. "You're under arrest for trafficking of minors, corruption, attempted murder, and," she paused, looking at the small girl still holding the gun, "and approximately 17 federal crimes that I'm still waiting for legal to enumerate." The federal agents moved in, restraining Hayes despite his protests, his threats, his pathetic attempts to claim self-defense. They read him rights he refused to acknowledge. They photographed the scene with mechanical precision. But the real moment came when Elena, barely conscious, was being transferred to a waiting ambulance. One of the paramedics gave her oxygen. One cleaned the blood from her face. And when they asked if she could confirm what happened, her voice came out like gravel through broken glass. "Hayes, he ran it. The foster homes. He was selling children. I have proof. I have recordings." She looked at Sofia. "And the girl, Sofia Rivera, she's not Marco's or Vincenzo's. The recording I left was about Luca. He came to me 9 years ago when I didn't have anything. He said he'd help. He said he'd protect me. And she coughed, blood speckling her lips. He was there when she was born. One photograph. He held her once, and then I left because I knew he'd die trying to protect her if he knew the truth. I knew she'd grow up in a world of violence if she knew who her father really was. The paramedics were already loading her into the ambulance, already moving toward the hospital where real doctors could assess the damage Hayes had done. Luca stood frozen. In the aftermath of violence, with Sofia still holding the gun and Elena's confession still echoing through the warehouse, the enforcer, the man who'd killed 17 people, who'd smashed Hayes into a fireplace, who'd stepped forward without hesitation to claim paternity, simply stood there unable to move. Because now it was real. Not a promise. Not a choice. Not something he'd decided in a moment of rage or protection. It was biology. It was Elena's voice confirming it. It was a 9-year-old girl who was definitively, irreversibly his daughter. Vincenzo placed a hand on Luca's shoulder. The architect's voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of a man who'd spent his life understanding what it meant to lead, to decide, to live with consequences. Now you understand, Vincenzo said quietly. Being a father isn't blood. It's what you do after the blood spills. He looked at Sofia, still holding the weapon, still standing in the space between child and survivor. It's this, he continued. It's standing in a warehouse where everything falls apart and deciding you're still going to show up. Every single day. For the rest of your life. The federal agents were securing the scene. Hayes was being loaded into a separate ambulance, his screams mixing with the sounds of sirens and procedural justice finally, arriving too late and just in time all at once. Chief Reynolds approached Vincenzo with a folder in her hands. Marco De Luca sold you out, she said without preamble. Full immunity deal in exchange for everything. Internal affairs connections, crime family movements, foster home trafficking details. He also tried to claim he was forced into the operation by you, but she pulled out a series of text messages from the folder. These suggest otherwise, that he was a willing participant in several schemes you three discussed, which means his immunity deal just became a lot less certain. Vincenzo took the documents without reading them. He already knew what they'd say. Betrayal documented in digital form. Weakness quantified in kilobytes. What happens to my daughter? Luca asked, his voice the sound of something being rebuilt in real time. She fired in self-defense, Reynolds replied, against an armed suspect who lunged for her. The shooting will be investigated. But given that Hayes is a serial abuser and she's 9 years old, she shrugged. The DA won't prosecute. Relief and guilt collided on Luca's face, creating an expression that couldn't be defined by any single word. Vincenzo, Luca, and Sofia walked out of the warehouse together as the sun was beginning to rise. Police lights still strobed around them. Evidence technicians still documented the scene. Hayes still screamed from the ambulance about injustice and conspiracy. But they walked out alive, changed, broken in new ways that healing wouldn't fix, but alive. And in their world, that was everything. The sunlight came through the windows of La Trattoria exactly as it had that first day. Golden, slanted, painting everything in amber and forgiveness. For weeks had passed. Elena Rivera sat at a corner table, her bruises fading into yellow and purple shadows that would eventually become memories. The left side of her face was still slightly swollen, but her eye was open now, and when she looked at Sofia, something in her expression suggested she was seeing her daughter for the first time since everything broke and got put back together differently. Sofia was drawing. Not pictures of guns or fear or dark warehouses. Just a simple sketch of the restaurant La Trattoria as it existed now, not as it had been. The architectural lines were careful, deliberate, almost meditative. Her small hands moved with the focus of someone learning to create instead of destroy. Luca watched from across the dining room. The enforcer had changed in ways that weren't visible to strangers. His face was still scarred. His hands were still stained with the history of violence. But something in the way he held himself, the angle of his shoulders, the softness in his eyes when he looked at his daughter, suggested that a man who'd spent decades building a reputation as a killer was learning, slowly and painfully, to build something else instead. Fatherhood. Not the biological accident of it, but the daily discipline of showing up. She smiled today, Luca said, joining Vincenzo at the bar. 3 times. Once at breakfast. Once when she asked about school. Once when Marco called. Vincenzo's expression didn't change, but his hand paused on the glass he was cleaning. Marco called? He asked quietly. Wanted to negotiate. Federal immunity falling through. Wants to make a deal with us instead of waiting for prosecution. What did you tell him? That he can disappear or he can face consequences. Those are his only options now. Vincenzo nodded, returning to his work. The sound of glass against cloth was meditative, almost ritualistic. In the weeks since the warehouse, he'd become obsessed with cleanliness. Not physical cleanliness, but moral cleanliness. It was impossible, he knew. You couldn't wash blood away. But you could try. You could spend every day trying. The Moretti family had transformed itself in ways that surprised everyone, including themselves. The protection rackets were gone. The drug operations had been systematized and pushed toward the edge, managed but not expanded. The corruption payments had been redirected toward legitimate businesses, real estate, restaurants, import services. Not enough to make them legitimate, but enough to make them defensible. And the foster home situation. Vincenzo had personally ensured that 47 children recovered from Hayes' trafficking ring were placed with families who would actually protect them. Not out of goodness. He had no illusions about his own nature, but out of a recognition that the girl sitting at the corner table, learning to smile again, deserved to exist in a world where that kind of predation wasn't profitable. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. Nico says he can have a clean identity set up for Marco within 2 days. Luca continued. New name, new city, new life. All he has to do is leave New York and never contact us again. Then give him that option, Vincenzo replied. And if he refuses, turn the evidence over to the DA. He made his choice when he walked out of this restaurant. He can live with it. The afternoon light shifted slightly. Elena called Sofia to the table for lunch, simple pasta, nothing elaborate, the kind of meal that belonged in a family rather than an empire. Sofia came immediately, her drawing abandoned, her attention fully on her mother. And then, as if on cue, the gun appeared. One of Vincenzo's craftsmen had finished it that morning. The weapon from that first day, the one Sofia had carried into this restaurant demanding answers, had been mounted on the wall behind the bar, preserved in glass. Below it, engraved on a copper plaque in letters that would last longer than any of them, the day a little girl reminded devils they still had hearts. Sofia noticed it immediately. She stood, abandoning her pasta, and walked to the bar. She looked up at the gun like it was a relic from someone else's life, which, in a way, it was. The child who'd carried that weapon didn't exist anymore. In her place was someone different. Not healed, but transformed. Does it ever hurt? She asked Luca, who'd moved to stand beside her. Knowing what I did? Luca's scarred face softened in a way that made him look almost gentle. Every day, he said honestly. But not in the way you think. Not because I'm ashamed of you. Because I'm ashamed it took a 9-year-old to teach me what matters. He placed his hand on her shoulder, careful, tentative, still learning how to touch his own daughter without fear of breaking her. The gun on the wall isn't about that moment, Luca continued. It's about what comes after. It's about understanding that sometimes you have to cross a line to save someone. And then you spend the rest of your life making sure that crossing meant something. Sofia nodded, though she didn't entirely understand. She was 9. Understanding would come later if it came at all. She returned to the table where Elena was waiting. As the afternoon deepened, the restaurant filled with the quiet sounds of normal life. Marco's name wasn't mentioned again. Hayes remained in his prison cell, nursing his shoulder wound and his broken rage. The police had moved on to other cases. The city had forgotten. But at La Trattoria, around the polished oak table where everything had begun, Sofia laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It wasn't a defiant laugh. It was just a child's laugh, small and real and earned through surviving something that should have destroyed her. Vincenzo, Luca, and Elena watched her laugh, and something in each of them recognized that this was the closest they would ever come to redemption. She walked into our world pointing a gun, demanding a father. She left with a family. That sounds like poetry, like one of those stories people tell to feel better about what they are. But it's just the truth. In the Moretti family, we learned that blood doesn't make you family. Choices make you family. Standing between a child and evil, that makes you family. Showing up every single day, even when it's hard, even when it requires becoming someone other than who you were, that makes you family. The gun on our wall isn't a trophy of violence. It's a reminder that sometimes angels don't have wings. Sometimes they have perfect aim. And sometimes they teach devils like us that we still have hearts. The day Sofia Rivera walked through our doors, the Moretti family died. What replaced it was something we're still learning to be. But every time I watch that girl laugh, I know it was worth the price.